The merciless midday sun beat down on Coyote Run Ranch, transforming the dusty earth into shimmering waves of heat that made the distant mountains waver like ghosts. 12-year-old Josie Barnes struggled under the weight of 2 wooden water buckets, her thin arms trembling as she made her way from the well toward the horse corral. Her faded blue calico dress, patched with scraps of brown cloth at the elbows and knees, clung to her small frame with perspiration. The worn leather of her oversized boots had rubbed raw blisters on her heels during the morning's endless chores. She had been hauling water for nearly 2 hours, her back aching from the constant lifting and carrying that came with her daily struggle to earn her keep. The ranch hands barely acknowledged her existence, except when they needed someone to blame for missing tools or spoiled milk. But that was the harsh reality of life as an orphan at Coyote Run Invisible, until needed forgotten, until faulted. As she approached the wooden corral fence, the horses inside began pawing at the hard-packed earth with unusual agitation. Their ears were pinned back flat against their heads, and their eyes showed white crescents of distress. The big sorrel mare that usually greeted her with a gentle nicker was instead pressing herself against the far fence, trembling, as if trying to escape something terrifying. "Easy, Duchess," Josie whispered, setting down her buckets with a soft thud. "What's got you all spooked?" That's when she saw him lying there like a broken doll. Luke Harlan, the ranch foreman, and the only human soul who had ever shown her a moment of genuine kindness, lay crumpled against the wooden fence posts. His weathered face was swollen beyond recognition, purple and black bruises blooming across his cheekbones like dark flowers. His eyes were nearly swollen shut, and his graying beard was matted with dried blood from his nose and split lip. His shirt hung in tatters, revealing angry red welts across his chest and ribs where someone had beaten him with methodical cruelty. The sight sent a jolt of pure terror through Josie's chest, making her heart race like a wild Mustang. She dropped to her knees beside him, her small hands hovering over his battered body as tears began to stream down her dust-stained cheeks. "Luke," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the nervous whinnying of the horses. "Luke, please open your eyes." His eyelids fluttered slowly, struggling to focus through the painful swelling. When he managed to see her face, he tried to speak, but only managed a weak cough that brought up specks of blood onto his beard. "Who did this to you?" Josie asked, though her sinking stomach already suspected the answer. Luke's cracked lips moved soundlessly for several moments before he managed to rasp. "Reed's boys. They found out I'd been sniffing around their business." The horses continued their restless pacing, their animal instincts, warning them that danger still lingered in the scorching air. In the distance, Josie could hear the harsh, satisfied laughter of men who had just finished their brutal work, laughter that made her stomach clench with dread. 2 years had passed since that terrible spring day when the sudden floods had transformed Miller's Creek into a raging torrent, sweeping away the wagon carrying her adoptive parents, John and Mary Barnes. The gentle couple had drowned in those churning waters, leaving 12-year-old Josie completely alone in an unforgiving world. With nowhere else to turn, she had been reluctantly taken in by Reed Thatcher, the owner of Coyote Run Ranch, who made it crystal clear from her first day that she would earn her keep through hard labor or find herself sleeping under the stars. Life at the ranch had become an endless cycle of hardship and neglect. She slept in the drafty hayloft above the stables, her only bed a collection of musty horse blankets that reeked of leather and hay. Each morning before dawn, she rose to muck out the stalls, feed the livestock, and perform whatever menial tasks the ranch hands considered beneath their dignity. Her meals consisted of leftover beans and stale hardtack, barely enough to sustain her growing body. Her once soft hands had become calloused and scarred from handling rope pitchforks and the countless tools of ranch work. But Luke Harlan had always been different from the others. The ranch foreman, a weathered man in his mid-40s, with kind gray eyes and silver threading through his dark hair, had noticed the struggling orphan when others looked right through her. He would slip extra biscuits into her apron pocket when no one was watching, share his morning coffee with her during the cold pre-dawn hours, and tell her stories about the old days to help her fall asleep in the lonely loft. "You know, Josie," he'd said just last week, watching her brush down one of the horses with gentle, patient strokes, "you remind me so much of my little Emma. She had the same way with animals, fearless but tender. Same reddish-brown hair that caught the light just like yours does. And when she smiled," his voice had grown thick with emotion, "when she smiled, she'd get this little dimple right here." He touched his own cheek, and Josie had unconsciously touched the matching dimple on her own face. Luke carried a burden of grief that seemed to weigh down his shoulders like an invisible yoke. 7 years earlier, during the bloody range war that had torn through the territory like wildfire, he had lost his wife Sarah and their 5-year-old daughter Emma when raiders burned their homestead to the ground. The tragedy had nearly destroyed him, driving him to seek solace in whiskey bottles for months until he finally sobered up and dedicated himself to honest work. Perhaps it was the memory of his lost child that made him protective of Josie. Or perhaps he simply couldn't bear to see another innocent soul suffer in silence. Sometimes, late at night in the hayloft, Josie would have strange dreams about fire and smoke, about a woman's voice calling her name through the flames. She would wake with her heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling that the dreams were more than just nightmares. They felt like memories trying to surface from some buried place in her mind. What neither Luke nor Josie knew was that Reed Thatcher, the ranch owner who presented himself as a legitimate cattleman to the outside world, was actually orchestrating a sophisticated criminal enterprise from Coyote Run Ranch. Reed had discovered early on that his intimidating presence and willingness to use violence made other ranchers reluctant to challenge him when cattle went missing or when property disputes arose. He had assembled a crew of dangerous gunmen who rustled cattle from neighboring spreads, altered brands with heated irons, and sold the stolen livestock in distant markets where no questions were asked. His crew included men like Scarface Charlie Morrison, a lean, vicious killer with a puckered scar running from his left ear to his mouth; Big Tom Rodriguez, a hulking brute who preferred using his fists to his gun; and Snake Williams, a soft-spoken man whose calm demeanor masked a ruthless nature. These men respected Reed out of fear rather than loyalty, having witnessed his cold-blooded ruthlessness enough times to know that crossing him was a death sentence. But Reed's criminal ambitions extended far beyond simple cattle theft. He had been systematically forging land deeds and legal documents, slowly expanding his holdings by claiming ownership of disputed territories through fraudulent paperwork. His ultimate goal was to control the entire valley, transforming himself from a common criminal into a legitimate land baron with real political power. The few honest men in the territory who might have exposed him were either intimidated into silence or driven away by his hired guns. Luke Harlan, however, had begun to notice troubling patterns. As ranch foreman, he had access to the books and records, and he had spotted discrepancies in the cattle counts, unexplained absences by Reed's men, and suspicious visitors who conducted their business in whispered conversations behind closed doors. His experience as a cavalry sergeant during the war had taught him to recognize when something wasn't right, and every instinct told him that Reed was running more than just a legitimate cattle operation. The morning of that fateful day had started like any other. Josie had been hauling water and cleaning stalls while the ranch hands prepared for what they claimed was another day of honest work. But as she went about her chores, she had noticed an unusual tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Reed's gunmen were gathered near the main house, their voices low and urgent, as they discussed something that made their weathered faces grim with worry. Curiosity had always been both Josie's greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. Unable to resist the urge to learn what had the men so agitated, she had crept closer to the hay bales stacked beside the barn, and hidden behind them, pressing her ear against the rough wood to catch their hushed conversation. "He's been poking around the office again," Charlie was saying, his scarred face twisted with concern. Found the bills of sale for those cattle we moved from the Peterson place last week, and he's asking too many questions about where they came from. How much does the old fool suspect? Reed's voice carried its usual deadly calm, but Josie could hear the underlying menace that made grown men tremble. More than we can afford to let him know, Big Tom rumbled in his deep voice. He's figured out that half those brands were altered, and Snake heard him asking around town about land deeds that don't match up with the county records. Worse than that, Snake added in his quiet, chilling tone. I think he might have found that old correspondence about the range war. The letters where you discussed certain arrangements. The mention of the range war made Josie's heart race. That was the bloody conflict that had killed Luke's family, the tragedy that had left him broken and grieving. But why would Reed's men be discussing it in such worried tones? If he's found those letters, Reed said slowly, each word dropping like a stone into still water, then he knows I ordered the raid on the Harlan place. He knows I'm the one responsible for killing his wife and daughter. The words hit Josie like a physical blow to the stomach. Reed had been responsible for Luke's family's death. The man who employed them both, who had reluctantly taken her in when she was orphaned, was the same monster who had destroyed Luke's life. What do you want us to do about it, boss? Charlie asked. Mayor, deal with him, Reed replied with chilling finality. You and Big Tom handle it now before he gets the chance to share what he knows with anyone else. Make sure he understands the price of sticking his nose where it doesn't belong. Josie felt her stomach drop as the full meaning of those words sank in. They were going to hurt Luke, possibly kill him. The only person who had ever shown her kindness, the only thing standing between her and complete isolation in this harsh world, was in mortal danger. She wanted to run to hide, to pretend she had never overheard this terrifying conversation. But the memory of Luke's gentle hands, sharing his meager breakfast with her, of his quiet voice, telling her stories to help her sleep, of the way he looked at her sometimes, with such sad affection, all of it gave her the courage she desperately needed. She had to warn him. But as she tried to creep away from the hay bales, moving as quietly as her worn boots would allow, she heard the sound of approaching footsteps and harsh voices from behind the barn. Men were laughing, the cruel, satisfied laughter of bullies who had just finished their savage work. That should teach him to mind his own damn business, Big Tom was saying with obvious satisfaction. Reed wants us to make sure he stays down permanent-like, Charlie added. Can't have him crawling off to tell tales to the sheriff. Josie's heart sank like a stone in deep water. She was too late. But she had to know for certain, had to see if there was any chance Luke might still be alive. Fighting back tears of frustration and terror, she forced herself to move toward the corral, where she prayed she wouldn't find confirmation of her worst fears. Now kneeling beside Luke's broken body in the blazing noon sun, she felt the crushing weight of responsibility settling on her young shoulders. He was alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow and labored, and she could see the agony in his swollen eyes every time he tried to move, even slightly. I have to get help, she said, starting to rise on unsteady legs, but Luke's hand shot out with surprising strength and gripped her wrist. And no. He whispered, his voice barely audible above the nervous whinnying of the horses. Too dangerous. They'll kill you too if they find out you know. The horses in the corral continued their anxious pacing, and their ears pricked forward as they sensed approaching danger. Josie looked around desperately, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what to do. Luke was far too heavy for her to carry, and if Reed's men returned to make sure he was dead, they would find her there with him. I can't just leave you here, she said, fresh tears streaming down her dust-stained cheeks. They'll come back to finish what they started. Luke's grip tightened on her wrist, and with obvious effort that made him wince with pain, he reached inside his torn shirt and withdrew a small leather pouch. His movements were slow and agonizing, but his eyes were suddenly alert and focused with desperate purpose. "Take this," he whispered urgently, pressing the pouch into her small hands. "Hide it where Reed can never find it. Don't let anyone know you have it, no matter what happens. Promise me." Josie looked down at the pouch, feeling the weight of important papers inside. "What is it?" "Evidence," Luke said, his voice growing weaker with each word. "Everything Reed's done. Bills of sale for stolen cattle-forged land deeds, correspondence with buyers in distant towns, and—" He paused, his face contorting with old pain. "The letters that prove he ordered the raid that killed my Sarah and Emma." The sound of heavy boots on hard-packed earth made them both freeze like rabbits sensing a predator. Someone was approaching the corral, and from the deliberate, unhurried footsteps, Josie could tell it was one of Reed's gunmen, returning to check on Luke's condition. Hide," Luke whispered urgently. "Take the pouch and hide now." But there was nowhere to go. The corral was surrounded by open ground, and the nearest cover was the stable building, at least 20 yards away, across exposed dirt. Josie looked at Luke's battered, trusting face and made a decision that would have seemed impossible just moments before. She slipped the leather pouch deep into her dress pocket, then summoned every ounce of strength in her small body. Working her arms under Luke's shoulders, she began the seemingly impossible task of dragging him toward safety. He was easily 3 times her weight, and his boots scraped against the hard ground as she pulled him inch by painful inch. Her back screamed in protest, and her arms trembled with the effort, but she refused to give up. Using the wooden water trough as partial cover, she managed to drag Luke's unconscious form behind it, just as the approaching footsteps grew louder. "Luke," Charlie's voice called out mockingly. "You still breathing over there, old man?" Josie pressed herself against the ground, one arm still wrapped protectively around Luke's chest, and held her breath. Her heart was beating so loudly, she was certain the gunman would hear it echoing across the silent ranch. Charlie rounded the corner of the corral rifle, held casually in his hands, and stopped where Luke had been lying. He looked around with the lazy confidence of a predator who expected no real resistance from his prey. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Where'd you crawl off to, you stubborn old fool?" The gunman began searching the area with methodical thoroughness, checking behind fence posts and peering into the shadows cast by the stable walls. Josie could hear his boots scraping against the ground as he moved closer to their hiding spot behind the trough. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Charlie shrugged and headed back toward the main house. "Probably crawled off to die somewhere private," he said to himself with cruel satisfaction. "Saves us the trouble of digging a hole." When she was absolutely certain he was gone, Josie resumed her desperate task. Her small body was trembling with exhaustion, and her dress was soaked with sweat, but she refused to give up. She spotted a discarded piece of fence rail nearby and used it as a lever, placing it under Luke's shoulders and pushing down on the other end to help move him more efficiently. By the time she finally managed to drag him inside the stable, her arms felt like they were on fire, and her legs were shaking uncontrollably. But she had done it. She had saved Luke from Reed's men, at least for now. The stable was dim and cool compared to the blazing sun outside, filled with the familiar smells of hay and leather that had become as much home to Josie as anywhere else. She dragged Luke to an empty stall and propped him up against the wooden wall, and then grabbed a bucket of water and gently splashed some on his face. "Luke, wake up," she whispered urgently. "We have to figure out what to do next." He opened his eyes, slowly wincing, as even the smallest movements sent waves of agony through his battered body. "Josie," he said, his voice slightly stronger now that he was out of the sun. Did you hide the pouch?" She patted her pocket carefully. "It's safe. But Luke, what are we going to do?" "They'll come looking for you again, and next time they won't be fooled by an empty corral." Luke tried to sit up straighter and gasped as the movement sent sharp pains through his cracked ribs. Listen to me very carefully. He said, his voice urgent despite his weakness. That pouch contains everything we need to destroy Reed and his entire criminal operation. There are bills of sale for stolen cattle with forged signatures, land deeds that have been altered to expand his holdings, and correspondence with buyers in markets hundreds of miles away. But most importantly, he continued, his face twisting with a mixture of pain and long-suppressed rage. There are letters that prove Reed ordered the raid on my homestead 7 years ago. Letters that show he's directly responsible for the deaths of my wife, Sarah, and my little Emma. Josie's eyes widened as she remembered the conversation she had overheard. So, what I heard was true. Reed really did murder your family. Not with his own hands, Luke said bitterly. But he might as well have lit the match himself. He wanted our land for his expanding cattle operation, and we were standing in his way. So he hired raiders to drive us off our property, and when we refused to leave, he closed his eyes, the memory still too painful to bear after all these years. They came at night and set fire to the house with Sarah and Emma inside. Why didn't you turn him in before now? Because I had no proof. Luke explained, his voice heavy with frustration. I suspected from the beginning, but suspicion isn't enough to hang a man in a court of law. It took me years to track down those letters, and by then I had already discovered enough of his other crimes to know that he would kill anyone who threatened to expose him. The sound of voices outside made them both tense. Reed's men were conducting a systematic search of the ranch, probably looking for Luke's body or any sign of where he might have gone. Josie could hear their boots echoing on the wooden walkways between buildings, getting closer with each passing minute. We have to get that evidence to Sheriff Morrison in town, Luke said. It's the only way to stop Reed and make sure he pays for what he's done. But the sheriff's office is in Millfield, 20 miles away, Josie protested. And you can barely sit up, let alone ride that far. Then you'll have to go without me. The words hit Josie like a physical blow. The idea of leaving Luke here, injured and helpless, while she rode alone across 20 miles of dangerous territory to reach town, was almost too frightening to contemplate. But before she could argue further, one of Reed's gunmen appeared in the stable doorway. Well, well, Snake Williams said, in his deceptively calm voice, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. Look what we have here. Snake was perhaps the most dangerous of Reed's men precisely because he didn't look dangerous. He was a slight man with thinning hair and quiet mannerisms, but his pale eyes held the cold, calculating stare of a born killer. He stepped into the stable, his boots making no sound on the hay-covered floor as he approached their hiding spot. Reed's been looking for you, Luke, he said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. Seems you picked up something that doesn't belong to you. I don't know what you're talking about. Luke said, his voice steady despite the pain and fear. Of course you do. A little leather pouch full of very interesting papers. Bills of sale, land deeds, personal correspondence. The kind of documents that could cause a man considerable trouble if they fell into the wrong hands. Josie felt the weight of the pouch in her pocket and tried to keep her expression neutral. If Snake suspected she had it, they would both be dead within minutes. I don't have any pouch, Luke said firmly. Snake's pale eyes studied Luke's face for a long moment, then turned to examine Josie with the same cold intensity. Maybe our young friend here knows something about it. You've been spending quite a bit of time around Luke lately, haven't you, child? He might have mentioned something to you. I don't know nothing about any papers, Josie said deliberately, using the rough grammar that most people expected from an orphan girl. I just clean the stalls and feed the horses. Snake continued to study her face, and Josie fought to keep her expression blank and innocent. After what felt like an eternity, he seemed to reach a decision. Well, it doesn't really matter, he said with a slight shrug. Reed wants both of you eliminated anyway. The girl knows too much about our operations, and Luke has become a liability that we can no longer afford. That's when Josie noticed the pitchfork leaning against the stall wall beside her. Without thinking, she grabbed it and swung it with all her strength at Snake's legs. The sharp tines caught him just below the knee, and he let out a scream of pain and surprise as he stumbled backward. "Run!" Luke shouted, but Josie was already in motion, grabbing his arm and helping him struggle to his feet. They stumbled out of the stable as Snake cursed and tried to untangle himself from the pitchfork, his shouts echoing across the ranch and alerting every gunman within earshot. Behind them, they could hear Snake bellowing for help, his voice carrying across the afternoon air like a war cry. They had minutes, maybe less, before Reed's entire crew would be hunting them down like wild animals. This way?" Luke gasped, pointing toward a cluster of rocks and scrub brush about 50 yards away. "We might be able to hide there until dark." But as they stumbled across the open ground, Josie realized that hiding would only delay the inevitable. Reed's men knew every inch of this ranch, and they had all the time in the world to search every possible hiding spot. Their only hope was to reach the main road and try to flag down a passing traveler who might help them get to town. As the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Reed called all the ranch workers to gather on the main porch of the house. From her hiding spot among the rocks, Josie watched with growing dread as Reed's cold eyes scanned the assembled men. "Boys," Reed began his voice, carrying the false warmth of a politician addressing his constituents. "We've had some serious trouble here today. Our foreman, Luke Harlan, has betrayed the trust we placed in him." A murmur of shock went through the crowd. Most of the honest ranch hands looked genuinely surprised by the accusation. But Reed's hired guns nodded in agreement, playing their rehearsed parts in the carefully orchestrated deception. "Luke has been stealing from this ranch for months." Reed continued, his voice hardening with manufactured indignation. "He's been selling our cattle to rustlers and passing information about our operations to our competitors. When my men confronted him about his crimes, he attacked them with a pitchfork and fled like the coward he is." The lies rolled off Reed's tongue with practiced ease, each word carefully chosen to paint Luke as the villain and himself as the wronged victim. Josie felt sick to her stomach as she watched him transform an honest man into a criminal with nothing more than carefully crafted words and false sincerity. "Luke is armed and extremely dangerous," Reed warned, his voice taking on a tone of grave concern. "He's stolen some important ranch documents that could seriously damage our business if they fall into the wrong hands. If anyone sees him, do not, I repeat, do not try to take him alive. He's already proven that he'll kill to protect his stolen goods." Reed's gaze swept across the assembled men and seemed to linger on the rocks where Josie was hiding. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, but she could feel his eyes searching for her like a physical weight. "I also have reason to believe," Reed continued, "that Luke might have had help from someone here on the ranch. The orphan girl has been seen in the places where Luke was hiding his stolen goods. She might know where he's gone or what he's done with the documents he took." Several of the men turned to look in Josie's direction, and she held her breath as Reed's suspicions became clear. He didn't just suspect her involvement, he was actively hunting her. "Find her," Reed ordered his men. "But remember, she's just a child. She might not even realize she's been helping a criminal. Try to bring her back alive so we can find out what she knows." As the men dispersed to begin their search, Josie overheard Reed speaking quietly to Charlie, who was still limping from his earlier encounter with the pitchfork. "That pouch contains more than just evidence of our current operations," Reed was saying in a low voice. "There's correspondence in there that could see me hanged for murder. If that girl has seen the contents and understands what they mean, then she's too dangerous to let live," Charlie finished. "You want me to make it look like an accident?" "Eventually," Reed replied. "But first I need to know exactly what she's seen and who she might have told. We can't afford to have any loose ends in this business." But it was Reed's next words that changed everything Josie thought she knew about her own identity and her connection to Luke, especially if she's really who I think she is. Reed continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I've been watching her for months now, and the resemblance is absolutely unmistakable. She looks exactly like Sarah Harlan did at that age. The same reddish-brown hair, the same green eyes, even the same little dimple when she smiles. Charlie's scarred face showed confusion. You think she's related to the Harlan woman? But that's impossible. The whole family died in the fire. That's what we were supposed to believe, Reed said grimly. But what if Sarah managed to get her daughter out of the house before the flames reached her? What if the little girl survived, and Luke has been living with his own daughter all this time, without knowing it? The words hit Josie like a bolt of lightning, making her grab the rough rock for support as the implications crashed over her like a massive wave. If what Reed was saying was true, then she wasn't just an orphan whose adoptive parents had drowned in Miller's Creek. She was Emma Harlan, Luke's daughter, the child everyone thought had perished in the fire 7 years ago. But how could that be possible? She had clear, vivid memories of John and Mary Barnes, and the gentle couple who had raised her. She remembered their kind faces, their loving voices, the way they had cared for her, until the flood swept them away. Those memories were real, weren't they? And yet, as she thought about it, she realized that her memories of life before the Barnes couple were strangely vague and fragmentary. She had nightmares about fire and smoke, dreams of a woman's voice calling her name through the flames. She had always assumed they were just the product of a frightened child's imagination. But what if they were actually memories trying to surface from some buried place in her mind? As she struggled to process this earth-shaking revelation, she heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Reed's men had found her hiding spot and were closing in from multiple directions. She had to move, had to get away, and find Luke to tell him what she had learned. But as she tried to slip away in the growing darkness, strong hands suddenly grabbed her arms and dragged her toward the ranch house. Charlie and Big Tom had caught her, and now she was trapped with no hope of escape. Well, well, Reed said as they brought her before him, his cold smile making her skin crawl. Little Josie Barnes. Or should I say, little Emma Harlan. The name hit her like a physical blow to the chest. Emma Harlan, Luke's daughter, the child who was supposed to have died in the fire years ago. But she was alive, had been alive all this time, living as an orphan, while her father grieved for a daughter he thought was dead. You're wondering how it's possible, Reed said, reading the confusion and growing terror on her face, with obvious satisfaction. Let me explain exactly what happened that night, 7 years ago. Reed began to pace back and forth in front of her, clearly enjoying her shock and confusion. When my men set fire to the Harlan house, your mother Sarah managed to get you out of the back room where you were sleeping before the flames could reach you. She was already dying from smoke inhalation, but she had just enough strength left to carry you to safety. There was a couple camped by Miller's Creek that night. Reed continued relentlessly. John and Mary Barnes travelers, who were passing through the territory looking for a place to settle down after losing their own daughter to fever. Sarah gave you to them with her dying breath, begging them to take you far away and keep you safe from the men who had destroyed her family. The pieces began to fall into place with sickening clarity. The Barnes couple hadn't been her real parents, but people who had taken in an orphan child and raised her as their own. The flood that had killed them 2 years ago had been tragically real, but they weren't her biological parents. They had been protecting her, hiding her identity from Reed's men, who would have killed her if they had discovered she had survived the fire. The Barnes couple kept you hidden for 5 long years. Reed continued with malicious glee. They changed your name from Emma Harlan to Josie Barnes, told everyone you were their daughter, and never let anyone know where you really came from. They knew I would kill you without hesitation if I discovered you had survived the fire. that was supposed to eliminate the entire Harlan family. Josie felt the world spinning around her as the full truth became clear. Luke, her real father, the man who had shown her such inexplicable kindness, who had shared his food and his stories, who had looked at her sometimes with such profound sadness. He had been mourning a daughter who was standing right in front of him, and neither of them had known it. But now you know the truth. Reed said, his voice turning cold and menacing. And that knowledge makes you incredibly dangerous to me and everything I've built here. You're living proof that I murdered Sarah Harlan and tried to murder her daughter. With you dead, Luke will have no family left to avenge, and the secret of what really happened that night will die with you. Reed's men dragged her toward the tack room, a small storage space where they could lock her up while they decided how to dispose of her permanently. But as they forced her inside and secured the door with a heavy chain, Josie realized that she was no longer just fighting for her own survival. She was fighting for the chance to reunite with the father who had never stopped loving her, even when he thought she was dead. And she was fighting to make sure that Reed Thatcher paid for the crimes he had committed against her family. The tack room was cramped and dark, filled with the pungent smell of leather oil and old saddles. But Josie had spent 2 years exploring every corner of this ranch, and she knew its secrets better than Reed's men did. She also knew that Luke had taught her to be resourceful, to never give up, even when the situation seemed hopeless. She felt along the walls until she found what she was looking for, a loose nail in one of the wooden boards that she had noticed weeks ago when she had been cleaning the room. It took her most of the night to work it free, but eventually she had a makeshift lockpick that she could use on the chain securing the door. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, she had managed to pick the lock and slip out of the tack room. The ranch was quiet, with most of Reed's men still sleeping off their drinking from the night before. This was her chance to find Luke and warn him about Reed's plans. She made her way carefully toward the cluster of rocks where they had been hiding, staying in the shadows and avoiding the main pathways where she might be spotted. But when she reached their hiding place, she found it empty. Luke was gone. Panic seized her as she realized that Reed's men might have found him during the night. But then she noticed faint marks in the dirt, scuff marks that suggested someone had been dragging himself along the ground. Following the trail, she realized that Luke had somehow managed to make his way back toward the stable. She found him in the same stall where they had hidden the day before, but his condition had worsened dramatically during the night. His face was pale and drawn, beaded with sweat from fever, and his breathing was shallow and labored. When she knelt beside him, she could feel the heat radiating from his body through his torn shirt. "Luke," she whispered, shaking him gently. "Luke, please wake up. It's me." His eyes opened slowly, and it took him several moments to focus on her face. "Josie," he said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought they'd caught you." "They did, but I got away. Luke, I have to tell you something incredibly important. I know who I really am now." But before she could explain what she had learned, the acrid smell of smoke began to fill the stable. Josie looked around in growing alarm as she realized what was happening. Reed's men had doused the building with kerosene and set it on fire. "They're trying to burn us alive," she said, grabbing Luke's arm. "We have to get out of here right now." The smoke was starting to thicken, and she could hear the frightened whinnying of horses in the other stalls. Luke struggled to sit up, his face contorting with pain from his cracked ribs. I can't move fast enough," he gasped. "The smoke will kill us both if you try to drag me out. You have to save yourself and go without me." "I'm not leaving you," Josie said firmly, her young voice carrying a strength that surprised them both. "You're my father, and I'm not going to lose you again." The words seemed to give Luke strength he didn't know he still possessed. "What did you say?" "I said you're my father. I'm Emma, your daughter, your little girl. Reed told me the truth last night. The Barnes couple who raised me weren't my real parents. They were protecting me from Reed after he burned our house and killed my mother. Luke's eyes filled with tears, and despite his pain, he reached out to touch her face with trembling fingers. Emma, my precious Emma. Yes, Papa. And I'm going to get you out of here. The fire was spreading rapidly through the dry wooden walls of the stable, sending thick, choking smoke billowing through the interior. The horses in the other stalls were beginning to panic, and Josie could hear their hooves pounding against the wooden barriers as they fought desperately to escape the flames. She tore a strip of cloth from her dress and tied it over Luke's nose and mouth. Breathe through this, she said, then did the same for herself. The smoke was getting thicker by the minute, and she knew they had only moments before it would overcome them both. Using all her strength, she managed to help Luke to his feet, and together they stumbled toward the back entrance of the stable. But the smoke was so thick now that they could barely see 3 feet ahead of them. Luke began coughing violently, and Josie realized that the smoke inhalation would kill him long before the flames could reach them. They were almost to the door when the terrified horses finally broke free from their stalls. The big stallion Thunder came charging through the smoke-filled stable like a demon from hell, his eyes wild with terror. Behind him, the sorrel mare Duchess and 3 other horses followed, their hooves striking sparks from the wooden floor as they sought escape from the inferno. The stable door burst open just as 2 of Reed's gunmen appeared, and their faces grim with deadly purpose. But the stampeding horses chose that exact moment to reach the exit, and the men had to dive aside to avoid being trampled by the panic-stricken animals. Charlie rolled to his left, cursing, as Thunder's hooves missed his head by inches. Big Tom threw himself against the stable wall as Duchess and the other horses thundered past, their manes streaming with smoke and their eyes rolling white with fear. In the confusion of rearing horses and billowing smoke, Josie and Luke managed to slip past the gunmen and into the open air. Behind them, the stable was beginning to collapse as the fire consumed the wooden support beams, sending showers of sparks across the dry grass. They weren't safe yet, though. Reed and 3 more of his men were mounting their horses, preparing to chase them down before they could escape with the evidence that would destroy him. The morning sun was rising over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to mock the violence unfolding below. The horses. Luke gasped, pointing to the animals that had fled the burning building. If we can catch one. Josie spotted Duchess, the gentle sorrel mare she had worked with many times before. The animal was milling around in confusion, too frightened to run far from the only home she had ever known. Josie approached her, slowly speaking in the soothing voice that Luke had taught her to use. Easy, girl. It's me, Josie. You know me, don't you? She managed to grab the mare's halter and quickly helped Luke climb onto the animal's back before swinging up behind him. Hold on tight, Papa, she said, kicking the horse into a gallop. We're going to get out of this nightmare. The chase began immediately as Reed spotted them fleeing across the open range. He and his 4 remaining gunmen thundered after them on horseback, their guns blazing as they tried to bring down the 2 fugitives. Take them alive if you can, Reed shouted to his men as they rapidly closed the distance. I want that pouch, and I want to know who else they might have told. Josie had grown up around horses, but she had never ridden at this breakneck pace before. Duchess's hooves threw up clouds of dust as they galloped across the rough terrain, and she had to grip the reins tightly to keep from being thrown from the animal's back. Behind her, Luke was barely conscious, slumped forward in the saddle and held in place only by her arm around his waist. The sound of gunfire cracked through the morning air like whips. A bullet whined past Josie's left ear so close she could feel the heat of its passage. Another struck a rock beside Duchess's front hooves, sending sharp fragments of stone flying. They're gaining on us, Josie shouted over the thunder of hooves and the whistle of bullets. They rode hard through a maze of rocky gulches and dry creek beds, the horses' hooves slipping on loose stones and sending small avalanches of pebbles cascading down the steep slopes. Josie's heart raced as she realized that one wrong step could send them both tumbling to their deaths on the jagged rocks below. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous as they descended into a narrow canyon. The walls rose steeply on both sides, and the path they were following was littered with loose rocks and debris from past rock slides. Duchess was breathing hard foam, flecking her muzzle as she struggled to maintain their desperate pace. That's when disaster struck. As they rounded a sharp bend in the canyon, the leather pouch containing all the evidence against Reed bounced out of Josie's dress pocket and fell to the rocky ground behind them. She watched in horror as it landed directly in the path of Reed's approaching horse. "The pouch!" she screamed, pulling hard on the reins to turn Duchess around. Reed saw it too and spurred his horse forward, leaning down from his saddle to grab the evidence that would mean his destruction. But Josie was desperate, and desperation gave her a courage she didn't know she possessed. She slipped down from Duchess's back and ran toward the pouch, diving for it, just as Reed's horse thundered overhead. Her fingers closed around the leather, just as the animal's iron-shod hooves came down, missing her by mere inches, but striking her left shoulder hard enough to send her tumbling across the rocky ground. "Got it!" she gasped, clutching the pouch to her chest, as she rolled away from the stamping hooves, ignoring the sharp pain in her shoulder. Reed pulled his horse around in a tight circle and leveled his revolver at her. His face twisted with rage and frustration. "Give me that pouch right now, you little brat, or I'll put a bullet in your head and take it from your corpse." "No," Josie said, struggling to her feet despite the pain in her shoulder and the cuts on her hands from the rocky ground. "This is proof of what you did to my family, to my mother and me. You're never getting it back." "Your family?" Reed laughed, a sound completely devoid of warmth or humor. "You mean the family I destroyed 7 years ago? I should have made sure you burned to death with your mother instead of leaving your survival to chance." But as Reed prepared to shoot, the sky suddenly darkened with massive storm clouds that had been building all morning. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, and within seconds the drops became a torrential downpour that turned the dust to slippery mud and made it difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. The sudden cloudburst was typical of the territory's violent weather patterns, but it couldn't have come at a worse time. Reed's men were having trouble controlling their horses in the storm, and their shots were going wide as the animals fought against the stinging rain. But Reed himself was still focused on Josie, his gun trained on her, despite the chaos erupting around them. "You're going to die here anyway," he shouted over the increasing roar of the storm. "This whole canyon floods when it rains hard like this. The water comes down from the mountains like a freight train, and there's nowhere to run. Give me the pouch, and I'll make your death quick instead of letting you drown slowly in the mud." The ominous sound of rushing water in the distance confirmed Josie's worst fears. The rain was feeding into the network of streams and creeks that flowed down from the high country, and the resulting flood was racing toward them with devastating force. It was the same phenomenon that had claimed the lives of John and Mary Barnes, the couple who had raised her after her real parents died. But instead of surrendering the evidence, Josie grabbed a loose rock from the ground, a piece of granite about the size of her fist, and hurled it at Reed's horse with all her remaining strength. The stone struck the animal in the shoulder, and it reared up in surprise and pain, throwing Reed from the saddle. He hit the ground hard, and Josie heard the distinctive crack of bone breaking as his left leg snapped beneath him. Reed screamed in agony and fury, but he was no longer an immediate threat. His men were too busy fighting the storm and their panicked horses to worry about chasing down a 12-year-old girl. The floodwater was rising rapidly now, and Josie could see that they only had minutes before the entire canyon would be underwater. She struggled through the increasingly treacherous mud toward Luke, who had managed to dismount from Duchess and was leaning heavily against a large boulder for support. "We have to climb," she shouted over the storm, pointing to higher ground about 50 yards away. "Can you make it?" Luke looked at the steep, muddy slope and then at his injured daughter. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'll try." Together, They began the desperate climb toward safety, the flood water lapping at their heels as they struggled up the rocky incline. The rain had made the rocks slippery and treacherous, and more than once Luke slipped and would have fallen if not for Josie's quick reflexes in grabbing his arm. Behind them, they could hear Reed's men shouting to each other as they tried to deal with the rising water and rescue their injured boss. Charlie had managed to reach Reed, but was knocked unconscious when his horse slipped on the wet rocks and threw him against a boulder. Snake Williams tried to ride to safety, but was caught by the current when his horse lost its footing in the rapidly rising water. "Help me!" Snake screamed as the flood swept him away, his pale eyes wide with terror. "I can't swim." But the rushing water carried him around a bend in the canyon, and his voice was lost in the roar of the torrent. Big Tom managed to reach higher ground, but abandoned any attempt to help his companions, more concerned with saving his own life than with loyalty to the man who had paid him. He spurred his horse toward the canyon rim and disappeared into the storm, leaving Reed and the others to face the flood alone. By the time Josie and Luke reached the safety of the rocky outcrop, the canyon below them was completely flooded. Reed was still alive, clinging desperately to a piece of driftwood as the current threatened to sweep him away. His broken leg made it impossible for him to swim to safety, and he was screaming for help that wasn't coming. "Please," he shouted up at them, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flood. "Don't let me drown. I'll give you anything you want." Josie looked down at the man who had murdered her mother and tried to kill her, the man who had caused so much pain and suffering over the years. For a moment, she felt a surge of satisfaction at seeing him helpless and afraid. Justice seemed to be taking its own course without any intervention from her. But then she felt Luke's hand on her shoulder, and she looked up to see him watching her with those gentle gray eyes that had always made her feel safe. "We're better people than he is," Luke said quietly. "We don't let anyone die if we can help it, even people who don't deserve our mercy." Josie nodded and looked around until she found a long piece of deadwood that had been washed up by the flood. Working together, she and Luke managed to extend it down to Reed so he could grab hold of it. They pulled him to the relative safety of a small ledge, where he lay gasping and shivering, his face pale with shock and pain. The county sheriff arrived just as the floodwaters began to recede, drawn by the massive column of smoke from the burning stable that could be seen for miles across the valley. Sheriff Tom Morrison had been investigating reports of cattle rustling in the area for months, and the destruction at Coyote Run Ranch demanded immediate attention. What he found was a scene of chaos and devastation that told a clear story of violence and desperation. The stable was a smoldering ruin. Reed Thatcher was lying on a muddy ledge with a broken leg, and his gunmen were scattered across the landscape, some dead, some injured, and others fled entirely. Josie and Luke were huddled together on the rocky outcrop above the flood zone, both of them soaked to the skin and exhausted, but very much alive. When she saw the sheriff's badge glinting in the afternoon sun, Josie summoned the last of her strength and carefully climbed down to meet him. "Sheriff Morrison," she said, pulling the precious leather pouch from her torn dress. "I have something you need to see." The sheriff was a weathered man in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much violence in his years of keeping the peace. He took the pouch from Josie and examined its contents with growing amazement and anger. "These are bills of sale for stolen cattle," he said, spreading the papers out on a flat rock. "And these land deeds are obvious forgeries. I can see where the names have been changed. But this..." He held up a handwritten letter. "This is correspondence that proves Reed Thatcher ordered the raid on the Harlan homestead that killed Sarah Harlan and supposedly killed their daughter. The daughter didn't die," Josie said quietly. "I'm Emma Harlan. Reed's men tried to kill me in that fire, but my mother got me out before they could finish the job. A couple named John and Mary Barnes took me in and raised me as their own daughter to protect me from Reed." Sheriff Morrison looked from Josie to Luke, who was slowly making his way down from the rocky outcrop with obvious difficulty. "Luke Harlan, Is this true? Luke nodded, his face filled with a mixture of joy and exhaustion. She's my daughter. I thought she was dead for 7 years, but she's been here all along, living as an orphan while I grieved for her. The sheriff immediately called for his deputies to arrest Reed and his surviving men on charges of cattle rustling, fraud, arson, assault, and murder. Reed, still writhing in pain from his broken leg and half drowned from the flood, tried desperately to deny everything. "You can't prove any of this," he snarled as the deputies put him in shackles. "Those papers could be forgeries themselves. This is all a setup." "Or maybe," Sheriff Morrison said calmly. "But we also have testimony from 3 of your men who decided to cooperate with the law in exchange for lighter sentences. Seems they don't want to hang for your crimes, Reed." As Reed was loaded into the back of a wagon for transport to the county jail, he looked at Josie with pure hatred burning in his eyes. "You should have died in that fire with your mother," he said through gritted teeth. "But I didn't," Josie replied, standing as straight as her exhausted body would allow. "And now, everyone will know exactly what you did." The sheriff arranged for a doctor to examine Luke's injuries, and while the physician worked to clean and bandage his wounds, Josie sat beside him and held his hand. The reality of their reunion was still almost too overwhelming to believe. "I'm so sorry I didn't recognize you sooner," Luke said softly. "I should have known. You have your mother's eyes and her courage." "You couldn't have known," Josie replied. "John and Mary Barnes changed my name and told everyone I was their daughter. They were protecting me the only way they knew how." "They were good people," Luke said. "I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful to them for saving you when I couldn't." 3 weeks later, Luke had recovered enough from his injuries to walk without assistance, and Sheriff Morrison returned to inform them that Reed Thatcher had been convicted on all charges and sentenced to hang. His surviving gunmen had received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life, and all the stolen cattle had been returned to their rightful owners. The ranch had been awarded to Luke as compensation for the crimes committed against him and his family, and he had already begun the process of rebuilding it into a legitimate cattle operation. The burned stable had been replaced with a larger, more modern building, and several honest ranch hands had been hired to help with the work. But the most important change was in Josie herself. No longer was she a frightened orphan girl sleeping in a drafty loft and scrounging for scraps of food. She was Emma Harlan, daughter of Luke Harlan, and she had a real home and family at last. As they sat together on the porch of their rebuilt home, watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Josie finally found the courage to ask the question that had been troubling her. "Papa," she said, the words still feeling wonderfully new on her tongue, "how did you know to keep looking for evidence against Reed? Most people would have given up after all these years." Luke was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "There's something I haven't told you," he said finally. "Something I found in your mother's things after the fire." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver locket tarnished with age, but still beautiful. "This belonged to your mother. I found it in the ashes of our house, and I've carried it with me every day since." Josie took the locket with trembling hands and opened it carefully. Inside was a tiny photograph of a woman with gentle eyes and a kind smile, her mother, Sarah Harlan. But it was the face of the small girl standing beside her that made Josie gasp with recognition. It was her own face, but younger, the face she had worn when she was 5 years old before the fire that had changed everything. "You've been wearing a locket just like this one," Luke said softly. "I noticed it the very first day you came to work at the ranch, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I think part of me always knew. I think my heart recognized you even when my mind couldn't accept the truth." Josie reached up to touch the locket she wore around her neck, the one John and Mary Barnes had given her, telling her it had belonged to her real parents. She opened it now and saw the same photograph and the same loving faces looking back at her. They must have found this locket with me when Mother gave me to them, she said, tears streaming down her face. They knew who I really was, but they kept me safe by hiding the truth. And now the truth has set us both free, Luke said, putting his arm around his daughter and pulling her close. As they sat together in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of their rebuilt ranch, Josie felt a peace she had never known before. The long nightmare was finally over, justice had been served, and she had found her way home to the father who had never stopped loving her. Reed Thatcher was dead, executed for his crimes. His criminal empire had crumbled. The ranch was thriving under Luke's honest management. And Emma Harlan, no longer the frightened orphan Josie Barnes, was exactly where she belonged. The wounded cowboy's secret had been revealed at last, and it had changed everything. Love had endured through the darkest trials. Family had found a way to heal even the deepest wounds. And in the end, justice had prevailed in the harsh but beautiful landscape of the American West.